Epilogue, Psyche and Cosmos by Richard Tarnas, Ph.D., Part 1. In the following pages, at Stanislav Grof's request, I have briefly outlined the research on which he and I have collaborated over the past 4 decades. Although during this time we have co-taught many graduate courses and public seminars that presented our ongoing findings, we have not published a basic overview of the research, despite how influential it has been for both of us in understanding the psyche and its transformational processes. With the current reemergence of legalized psychedelic psychotherapy and research, however, it may be appropriate now to introduce here to a wider public at least a brief summation of the evidence and its potential relevance for psychotherapy and self-exploration working with psychedelics and other transformational methods that involve non-ordinary states of consciousness. Background of our research. After his years of practicing psychotherapy using LSD and other psychedelic substances, first in Prague and later in Maryland, Stan moved in the fall of 1973 to Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, to work on the series of books that would summarize his clinical findings. A few months after he arrived there, I joined him to work under his supervision on my doctoral dissertation on LSD psychotherapy. The move to Esalen turned out to be long-term and pivotal for both of us. During the greater part of the 1970s and 1980s, Stan served as Esalen's scholar-in-residence and led many month-long seminars, while I, first as staff member and later as Esalen's Director of Programs and Education, collaborated with him on the research recounted here. In 1993-94, we both joined the faculty of the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where we would teach for the next 20 years. At the start of our work together at Esalen, we were interested in the radical variability of psychedelic experiences, a phenomenon widely observed but not well understood. 2 individuals of similar clinical status could ingest the same substance, the same number of micrograms, in the same clinical setting, and yet could undergo extremely different experiences. One subject might have an experience of deep spiritual unity and euphoric mystical transcendence, while another, who had received the identical substance and dosage, might confront a state of sustained metaphysical panic or a condition of bottomless despair that promised never to resolve. Similarly, the same person at different times could have strikingly different psychedelic experiences. The variability also took another form, in which different individuals seemed to be constitutionally prone to encounter certain enduring constellations of related experiences. Particular complexes, emotionally charged biographical memories, perinatal matrices, transpersonal encounters, in an evolving way through multiple psychedelic sessions, reflecting specific persistent themes in their life's personal journey. Each individual seemed to have his or her own characteristic set of enduring themes that in the course of time could take variable forms, with either positive or negative inflections at multiple levels of consciousness, often in the same session. Stan and his colleagues in Prague and Baltimore had long sought a reliable way to predict the nature and outcome of psychedelic sessions, hoping to find tools that would be helpful for anticipating how different individuals might react to psychedelic therapy and whether they would benefit from it. Yet years of research on the problem had been unsuccessful, as none of the standard psychological tests, the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, POI, Personal Orientation Inventory, TAT, Thematic Apperception Test, Rorschach Test, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and others proved to have any predictive value for this purpose. Such an outcome was in a sense understandable for at least the second form of variability, involving the same person taking the same substance at different times, because retesting individuals with standard psychological tests typically does not change the results. If one tests today and tests again a month from today, the results will not significantly change. Whereas if a subject takes LSD today and then takes the same dose next month, the session could be altogether different. Yet given the intensity of psychedelic experiences, the possibility of being able to anticipate how different individuals might respond to such therapy, perhaps even how the same individual might respond at different times, impelled the hope that a useful method might someday be found. While we were not fully aware of it at the time, several decades earlier, C.G. Jung had opened up another possible approach to this variability in psychological experience. On the basis of lengthy studies of various esoteric systems, he came to regard astrology as providing an extraordinary window for understanding the qualitative dimension of time, and specifically the archetypal dynamics at work at any particular time, including that of birth. He posited that time was not merely quantitative, an ongoing neutral or homogeneous continuum, but rather possessed an intrinsically qualitative dimension. More surprisingly, he came to believe that the qualitative dimension of time was intrinsically connected in some undetermined manner to the positions of the sun, moon, and planets relative to the earth. As he wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, our psyche is set up in accord with the structure of the universe, and what happens in the macrocosm likewise happens in the infinitesimal and most subjective reaches of the psyche. In his later years, Jung came to employ the analysis of birth charts as a regular aspect of his analytical work with patients. Yet given the intellectual climate of his time, and indeed of our own time, one can well appreciate his reluctance to make more public the extent of his use of astrology. He had already pushed the envelope of 20th century intellectual discourse about as far as could be sustained. During the years of Stan's and my residence there, Esalen Institute was well known as an educational center where an unusually diverse range of perspectives and transformational practices was explored, Eastern and Western, ancient and contemporary, psychological, somatic, philosophical, scientific, shamanic, mystical, esoteric. Of all these perspectives and practices, astrology was perhaps the last one that either of us would have imagined seriously investigating. In contemporary intellectual culture, astrology has served as a kind of gold standard of superstition, that to which one compares something if one wants to emphasize how ludicrous it is and beneath serious discussion. Nevertheless, in early 1976, prompted by a suggestion from an Esalen seminar participant who had extensively studied astrology, we decided we should at least examine the evidence for possible correlations. The participant, an artist named Arnie Tretovic, was especially focused on the study of planetary transits, the ongoing movement of the planets from day to day, year to year, as they move into specific geometrical alignments with respect to an individual's birth chart. He studied the ways in which transits seem to correspond with the variable kinds of experiences people undergo in the course of life, periods especially marked by personal happiness or failure, for example, or falling in love, entering a new phase of life, and so forth. After hearing Stan's lectures, he had suggested that planetary transits might be similarly relevant for understanding the kinds of experiences people would have in the powerful states of consciousness catalyzed by psychedelic substances. Stan in turn mentioned the idea to me, and subsequently Tretovic showed us how to calculate birth charts as well as transits, using the necessary reference works such as a planetary ephemeris, a world atlas with time zone references, and the required mathematical tables. This was still in the years before personal computers were available, so each birth chart and transit calculation had to be done by hand. We also secured several standard interpretive reference works that set out the characteristic meanings for various planetary combinations and their alignments as measured in celestial longitude along the ecliptic. For example, Saturn opposite the Sun, or Jupiter conjoining the Moon. We began our research using Reinhold Ebertein's transits and the individual planets' transit booklets by Francis Psychonaut and Louis Acker, followed soon after in those early months by the just-published Planets in Transit by Robert Hand, Ebertein's The Combinations of Stellar Influences, Charles Carter's Principles of Astrology, Psychonaut and Acker's Handbook of Astrology, and several pioneering works by Dane Rudhyar. Because Stan and I both had records for our own LSD sessions over the years, including dates and major themes, we were able to compare retrospectively our actual experiences with the descriptions in the astrological texts of what kinds of events and experiences were supposedly likely to take place during the concurrent transits. Initial correlations. Much to our astonishment, we were highly impressed by both the quality of the correlations and their consistency. What we had experienced in our sessions during those transits seemed to be archetypally intensified versions of the more common life experiences that were generically described in the astrological texts. For example, based on the specific planets and alignment involved, the text might indicate that the period of a particular planetary transit was potentially an appropriate time for expanding one's intellectual horizons, learning new perspectives, or traveling to a distant country and discovering a new culture. It might indicate a period of potentially increased spiritual insight, or by contrast, increased tensions and frustrations within one's career, or the emergence of problematic family issues. One transit might be described as coinciding with greater accident proneness and risk-taking impulses, while another might be characterized as indicating a greater potential for heightened anger or aggressiveness, depression, or generalized anxiety. These astrological text descriptions of more common circumstances and emotions proved helpful for us in gaining a sense for what underlying archetypal energies might be at work in each case. In fact, I was very much struck by how the underlying archetypal nature of the astrological paradigm was apparent even in the many astrological texts that did not use a Jungian vocabulary or reflect a conscious relationship with the Platonic tradition, or with its own deeper esoteric roots in which some form of the archetypal perspective was central. Each planet was understood as bearing an underlying cosmic association with a particular archetypal principle, which could express itself multivalently in diverse inflections and in different dimensions of life. Psychologically, circumstantially, interpersonally, physically, and so forth, but always with a clear connection to the essential nature of that archetypal complex. The correlations were not concretely predictive, but rather archetypally predictive. Based on our records of experiences during such transits, it seemed that LSD sessions typically catalyzed more intense, often perinatal or transpersonal versions of the more common states and themes, the ordinary ups and downs of life described in the standard astrological texts. During the psychedelic session, one might experience a sudden opening of consciousness to a much vaster view of reality, deep insight into another culture's religion or mythology, mystical awakening, spiritual rebirth, or conversely, powerful states of cosmic aloneness, a sudden confrontation with the ruthless inevitability of human mortality, or an eruption of collective aggression and fear, such as that activated in an entire nation at war. One factor that made the correlations much easier to recognize than expected was the fact that in psychedelic states, the archetypal qualities constellated during the session tended to be unmistakable because of their relative intensity. For example, not only feeling constrained or oppressed by one's particular life circumstances, but undergoing a deep experiential identification with all people who have ever been imprisoned or enslaved. And in turn, most surprisingly, those qualities were intelligibly correlated with the individual's natal chart and current transits. On occasion, the experiential intensity within the psychedelic session could take the form of a direct experience of the archetypal dimension that underlay both the more ordinary conditions and the collective transpersonal experiences, with the particular mythic figures or archetypal powers encountered closely matching the specific archetypal principles that the astrological tradition associated with the relevant natal and transiting planets. After this initial examination of our own sessions, we turned our attention to a larger range of individuals and their experiences, beginning with the 50 or 60 long-term members of the Esalen community who requested to have their transits calculated and interpreted, then expanding the research to include the many seminar participants who came to Esalen week after week. The Institute was in fact an ideal laboratory for such research, as thousands of people traveled there each year with the specific intention of pursuing deep self-exploration and potentially transformative experiences. Esalen was at that time a kind of epicenter of psycho-spiritual experiment and consciousness research. We therefore had available a substantial and continually growing database to work with. In addition to these current cases, we had access to case histories, session dates, and birth dates of a number of Stan's patients and subjects from previous years. I should mention that despite our initial impression that the evidence showed remarkable correlations, our understanding of the nature of those correlations arrived in halting stages that produced significant revisions in our first tentative conclusions. Over time, our grasp of the evidence underwent a definite evolution. We initially noticed a very general division in which transits involving certain planets and alignments seemed to coincide with easier, more smoothly resolved sessions, while other transits seemed to coincide with more difficult sessions that ended without resolution. Then more specific observations emerged concerning sessions that brought dramatic psychological and spiritual breakthroughs in comparison with others that remained stuck in agonizing no-exit situations. Eventually, through much trial and error, it became apparent that these simple binary patterns masked a far more complex interplay of multiple transiting and natal factors that were involved in the fuller range of psychedelic experiences in their extraordinary diversity. Correlations with perinatal experiences. An especially surprising finding from the early period of research concerned a remarkably robust correlation between the 4 basic perinatal matrices, BPMs, and the 4 outer planet archetypes as described in the standard astrological texts. On the one hand, the complex phenomenology of each BPM had first been extracted from psychedelic session reports and described by Stan in the mid-1960s, by which point he had recognized the connection between these 4 dynamic constellations of experience and the successive stages of biological birth. On the other hand, working within a completely distinct tradition of research and interpretation going back many centuries, astrologers had gradually arrived at a strong consensus about the meanings of Saturn, the outermost planet known to the ancients, and over the past 2 centuries, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, discovered by telescope in the modern era. Fairly early in the research, I had noticed an apparent one-to-one general correspondence between experiences reflecting the 4 perinatal matrices and coinciding transits involving the 4 slower-moving outer planets. For the sake of simplicity and brevity, I will include Pluto here as a planet. The correlations we consistently observed with respect to Pluto did not seem to reflect any tangible difference in archetypal importance compared with correlations involving Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, and the other traditional planets. To our amazement, upon closer reading of the astrological texts, it became apparent that every single feature of the 4 BPMs closely fit the widely accepted astrological meanings of the 4 outer planets. Because the perinatal category of correlations is typical of the kinds of archetypal experiences we subsequently found involving the wider range of psychedelic experiences we researched, I will take a moment here to indicate the correspondences involved, comparing the phenomenology for each matrix as set forth in Stan's work with the standard planetary meanings delineated in the astrological literature. I will begin with BPM 4, the first perinatal matrix for which I noted this pattern. The 4th perinatal matrix is associated both biologically and archetypally with the emergence from the birth canal and the moment of birth. It is reflected in experiences of sudden breakthrough, unexpected liberation, release from constriction and imprisonment, brilliance of vision and understanding, awakening to a sense of deeper meaning and purpose in life, being flooded by intense bright light, sudden intellectual and spiritual illumination, the feeling of being reborn after a long and dangerous passage, and so forth. In its negative aspect, when activated but uncompleted, BPM 4 can take the form of manic inflation, restless impatience, eccentric ideation accompanied by a sense of unprecedented personal brilliance, insatiable craving for excitement, and compulsive hyperactivity. Having observed a correlation between BPM 4 experiences and major transits of Uranus, I was very much struck by how fully the set of symbolic meanings universally attributed to Uranus by contemporary astrologers coincides with the phenomenology of BPM 4. The astrological Uranus is typically described as the principle of sudden change, of unexpected openings and awakenings, creative breakthroughs and inventiveness, brilliance of inspiration and achievement, sudden illumination and flashes of insight. It is also associated with the impulse toward freedom, rebellion against constraints and the status quo, tendencies toward eccentric or erratic behavior, instability, restless unpredictability, the drive toward novelty and the new, the unexpected, the disruptive, the exciting and liberating. By contrast, the second perinatal matrix is associated with the difficult perinatal stage of uterine contractions when the cervix is still closed. BPM2 is typically expressed in experiences of claustrophobic constriction, images of imprisonment and hell, physical and emotional pain, helpless suffering and victimization, fear of dying, states of intense shame and guilt, depression and despair, feelings of no exit in Sartre's sense, existential alienation and meaninglessness, being trapped in a perspective in which all that exists is mortal life in a disenchanted material world with no deeper meaning or purpose. In this case, I noticed how often the planet Saturn was involved in transits that coincided with BPM2 states. And again, the set of symbolic meanings long attributed by the astrological tradition to the planet Saturn closely matched the BPM2 phenomenology: constraint, limitation, contraction, necessity, hard materiality, the pressures of time, the weight of the past, strict or oppressive authority, aging, death, the endings of things, judgment, guilt, trials, punishment, the tendency to restrict, hold back, burden, separate, negate and oppose, to experience difficulty, problems, decline, deprivation, defeat, loss, the labor of life, the workings of fate, karma, the consequences of past action, pessimism, melancholy, the dark, cold, heavy, dense, dry, old, slow. However, whereas in the three other cases, both positive and negative sides of the astrological principle involved seem to be expressed in the large range of potential experiences related to each perinatal matrix, in the case of BPM2, only the negative and problematic features of the Saturn archetype were evident. Subjects under the sway of the second perinatal matrix seem to experience everything through an encompassingly negative filter that allows no positive or redeeming dimension of life. Only in retrospect, after the perinatal process has unfolded and been, at least to some extent, resolved and integrated, does the experience of BPM2 become seen in a different light with new meaning. Then the positive dimension of contraction, separation, loss, suffering, the encounter with death, and so forth, becomes altogether evident in the concrete manifestations of biological birth or spiritual rebirth, in the experience of having joined the realm of the grateful dead, because one is now happily reborn. The crushing defeat of the old identity or structure of reality is seen as making possible an enduring wisdom that has known both sides of life, and that can embrace pain and loss as necessary for a deeper mode of being. The realities of aging and of mortality itself are seen in a new way, permitting the emergence of the positive qualities that are also traditionally associated with the Saturn archetype. Stan and I were especially struck by the uncannily similar, Indeed, virtually identical sets of meanings correlating BPM-3 with the astrological Pluto. The phenomenology of the third perinatal matrix is unusually diverse and brings together a unique constellation of extremely intense experiences. In terms of the stages of biological birth, it is associated with the propulsion of the baby through the birth canal with the cervix fully dilated. Experientially, one finds a powerful convergence of experiences involving titanic, elemental energy of volcanic proportions, intense arousal of sexual libido and aggression, enormous discharge of pent-up energies, dramatic experiences involving violent struggle, life and death danger, bloody biology, war, scenes of immense destruction, descent to the underworld, demonic evil, sadomasochism, pornographic sexuality, degradation and defilement, scatology, sewers and decay, purifying fire or pyrocatharsis, elemental transformation, ritual sacrifice, orgiastic bacchanalia, and the paradoxical merging of agony into ecstasy. In general, BPM-2 represents overwhelmingly intense elemental energies within a cathartic, transformational crucible that culminates in the experience of death and rebirth. Given these several distinctive themes converging within one perinatal matrix, we found the consistent coincidence of BPM-3 experiences with transits of Pluto especially extraordinary, for the descriptions of the many-sided principle of Pluto by contemporary astrologers encompassed precisely the same convergence of diverse themes. Elemental intensity, depth, and power, that which compels, empowers, and intensifies whatever it touches, sometimes to overwhelming and catastrophic extremes. A dominant concern with survival, sexuality, or power, the lower chakras, the primordial instincts, both libidinal and aggressive, destructive and regenerative, the volcanic, cathartic, eliminative, transformative, ever-evolving, the biological processes of birth, sex, and death, the cycles of death and rebirth, breakdown, decay, and fertilization, violent purging of repressed energies, situations of life and death extremes, power struggles, all that is titanic, potent, and massive, the powerful forces of nature emerging from its chthonic depths, both within and without, the intense, fiery underworld and underground in many senses, geological, psychological, sexual, urban, political, criminal, demonic, mythological. Freud's primordial id, the broiling cauldron of the instincts, Darwin's ever-evolving nature, and the biological struggle for existence. As with other perinatal matrices, subjects often had direct experience of specific mythic deities when reaching the deeper dimensions of that matrix. In the case of BPM-3, the mythic figures encountered tended to be the same as those brought up in the astrological texts describing the nature of the Pluto archetype. Deities of destruction and regeneration, descent and transformation, death and rebirth, such as Dionysus, Hades and Persephone, Pan, Priapus, Medusa, Lilith, Inanna, the volcano goddess Pele, Quetzalcoatl, Kundalini activation and the serpent power, Shiva, Shakti, Kali. Finally, a similar set of parallels was apparent in examining the coincidence of the very different range of BPM-1 experiences with transits of Neptune. The first perinatal matrix is associated with the prenatal condition immediately prior to the beginning of the birth process. Experiences of the amniotic universe, floating oceanic sensations, the melting of boundaries, a porous relationship to the environment, lack of differentiation between inner and outer, embryonic experiences multidimensionally blended with aquatic, interstellar, galactic, and cosmic experiences. Here also are found experiences of mystical unity, spiritual transcendence, the dissolution of material reality and of the separative ego, a sense of merging with the womb, with the mother, with other persons or beings, with all life, with the divine, access to other ontological dimensions beyond consensus reality, transcendence of time and space. Experiences of idyllic nature, such as tropical islands, or childhood play in beautiful meadows or on seashores, can merge into experiences of cosmic unity, oceanic ecstasy, and images of paradise. In its negative aspect, BPM-1 is associated with experiences that involve a disorienting loss of boundaries, the dissolving of a stable identity or reality structure, susceptibility to delusional thinking, feeling enveloped by a threatening atmosphere filled with invisible dangers and subtly infecting influences, and experiences of a toxic womb merging into experiences of drug poisoning, psychic contamination, or oceanic pollution. Remarkably, astrologers symbolically associate the planet Neptune with experiences having a spiritual, transcendent, or mystical character. With the subtle and intangible, the unitive, timeless, immaterial, and infinite. All that transcends the limited world of matter, time, and concretely empirical reality. Neptune is connected with states of psychological fusion, physical and psychological permeability, and the longing for the beyond. It has a symbolic association with water, the sea, streams and rivers, mist and fog, with liquidity and dissolution of any kind, and with what Freud termed the oceanic feeling. Negatively, it is seen in tendencies toward illusion and delusion, Maya, deception and self-deception, disorganization, escapism, intoxication, addiction, perceptual and cognitive distortions, projection, inability to distinguish the inner world from the outer, and vulnerability to toxic drug reactions, infections, and contamination. With respect to all four perinatal matrices, what especially struck us was the twofold nature of the correlations. On the level of the comparative study of symbol systems, the fact that two entirely distinct interpretive traditions, psychology and astrology, could have independently formulated four fundamental sets of qualities and meanings which so closely corresponded to each other, point for point, matrix to archetype, was certainly surprising on its own terms. But apart from these clear parallels of meaning, the fact that the timing of subjects' experiences of each perinatal matrix and psychedelic sessions actually coincided so consistently with transits involving the very planet that bore the matching astrological character seemed to us astounding. These perinatal correspondences that emerged into view early in our research became greatly complexified as time passed, and we gained a greater understanding of how the major geometrical alignments involving two or more planets, the major planetary aspects such as conjunction, opposition, and square, played out in natal charts and transits. For example, Neptune transiting a person's natal sun seemed to play out differently than if it transited the moon, even though there were common Neptunian features in both instances. In the case of Neptune transits to Saturn, the coinciding experiences tended to be in certain respects virtually opposite those of Neptune transits to Jupiter, though again they had essential underlying features in common that reflected in different ways the archetype associated with Neptune. The differences in each case were directly related to the archetypal qualities associated with the second planet involved in the transit. Each planetary combination seemed to involve a mutual activation of the two archetypal principles involved, with each archetype infusing and inflecting its specific nature through the other, with each archetype thereby shaping the expression of the other, and creating a live compound of the two. Moreover, different individuals seem to experience the same transit of a specific planet to a natal planet differently depending on how that natal planet was situated relative to the other planets in the birth chart, or depending on what other transits were going on simultaneously. Nothing happened in a vacuum. Everything was always situated in and shaped by a unique context, whether biographical and circumstantial, cultural and historical, or archetypal. As another example of these complexities, in full-fledged BPM2 experiences, a specifically perinatal level of content in psychedelic sessions generally seemed to involve the presence of Saturn in alignment with one of the three outer planets, Pluto, Neptune, or Uranus. A Saturn transit on its own, for example in alignment with the Sun, Moon, or one of the inner planets, tended to coincide with more common life experiences reflecting the various themes associated with the Saturn archetype. By contrast, experiences of BPM2 were more likely during Saturn transits that involved Pluto or Neptune, each bringing out specific inflections of the second matrix reflecting the relevant archetype. Saturn with Pluto, for example, being more likely to coincide with experiences of helpless suffering in the face of extreme cruelty or titanically intense contractions with no release, while Saturn with Neptune was found more in the case of confrontations with the meaninglessness of mortal life, the dark night of the soul, loss of spiritual meaning, suicidal despair, or fears of insanity. Transits involving Saturn together with Uranus were more associated with experiences involving the sudden confrontation with death, unexpected fall from grace, or the sudden collapse of previously secure structures, whether of identity or of reality itself. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto all seem to have a more emphatically transpersonal character, while Saturn represented more of a symbolic threshold between the personal and transpersonal, and between life and death. Moreover, all of the above combinations of planets in transit could unfold in ways that moved through the perinatal depths into very different healing inflections of the same archetypal principles. Stan's dictum that the full affective and somatic experience of a difficult emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion was relevant to understanding how a given archetypal complex could evolve from its most challenging forms to highly positive expressions. Thus, after the integration of traumatic or otherwise problematic unconscious material, including BPM-2 experiences of hellish torment, Saturn-Pluto transits were observed in connection with a new capacity for unflinching courage in the face of death and danger, a new willingness to engage life's gravest realities and bear great burdens, to mobilize immense energies with sustained effort and determination for prolonged periods of time, as in the titanic hard labor of birth. Similarly, experiences during Saturn-Neptune transits could unfold into heightened compassion for the suffering of others, and sustained practical efforts to alleviate that suffering, a new capacity for sacrifice and renunciation of personal attachments in the service of one's spiritual aspirations, or bringing spiritual ideals into concrete manifestation in a practical, focused, and disciplined way. Such complexities reflected the intrinsic multivalence of archetypes, their carrying a far greater range of interconnected meanings than a simplistic grid could ever convey. It also gradually became clear that the archetypes that we observed in perinatal experiences and that corresponded with the specific transiting and natal planets seem to exist at a supraordinate level with respect to the perinatal dimensions of the psyche. This supraordinate status became apparent when we noticed a remarkable category of correlations involving the coex systems, which informed not only the biographical level of the unconscious, but also the transpersonal, with the perinatal level often serving as an experiential gateway between the two realms.